Communism is undoubtedly one of the least favorable ideologies to people in Brazil and around the world. And most of the countries that followed this path ended in terrible collapses. The Soviet Union crumbled, Cuba never moved forward. Venezuela, which was once one of the richest economies in South America, became synonymous with food lines. North Korea became synonymous with an absurd dictatorship. The pattern then seems very clear: communism does not work. But there is one country that defies this idea, a country that claims to be communist and has not failed. In fact, it has grown so much that it even instills fear in the current world leaders. And that country is, without a doubt, China. In less than 50 years, it transformed from a completely devastated nation with hundreds of millions of people in extreme poverty to becoming the second largest economy in the world. And some say it's on the path to becoming the first now. But what's behind this growth? And what if I told you there's an untold story? A very dark side that many prefer to hide? This is the story of how communism succeeded in China. Welcome to the channel, subscribe if you're new here, and let's go. Before understanding today's China, we need to understand why communism failed in almost every place it was applied. And no, this didn't happen by chance. The classic model, the one that came from Marx's books and was applied by Lenin in Russia, then Stalin, envisioned that the state would control everything: production, distribution, prices, sales, factories. Everything that existed belonged to the state. The idea was that without the greed of capitalism, society would organize itself and people would be fairer and more efficient too. But in practice, what happened was exactly the opposite. When the state controls everything, no one has the incentive to produce more. So the economy in those places stagnated. And another thing, when the state has too much power, which happened a lot actually, there was corruption. When there is no freedom of expression, the government's mistakes are never corrected in time because no one even has the time to point them out. The Soviet Union was the most emblematic example of this. For about 7 decades of state control, it ended in economic collapse and territorial fragmentation. Cuba to this day depends on external aid to avoid complete collapse. Venezuela, for example, had abundant oil and yet sunk. North Korea is a case apart. It's a kind of living museum of what happens when this ideology completely closes itself off to the world. But what about China? Why is China different? This question will accompany us throughout this video, and the answer is actually not that simple, and I'll explain the reasons here. To understand what China has become, we also need to know what it was before. And China's starting point here was in the 19th century. China was one of the oldest and most populous nations in the world, but also one of the most weakened. The Qin Empire, which had ruled the country for centuries, was practically in decline, and it was precisely at this moment of weakness that the great powers of the world saw an opportunity. England forced China to accept the importation of opium, a product that destroyed generations of Chinese, simply because they wanted to balance their trade. When China tried to resist, then came the war, and then another. And with each lost conflict, China was forced to sign humiliating treaties. It had to cede some territories, some ports, and its sovereignty to outside countries. The Chinese call this period the Century of Humiliations, and it's not just a metaphor, okay? For 100 years, from the 19th century to 1949, China was occupied, divided, and truly humiliated. Japan invaded the country in the 1930s and committed terrible things that I can't even mention here in the video. The Chinese territory itself became a battlefield among various groups, with various people vying for power while the people were in need. And it is in this context, in a shattered country, with no one united, without hope, and without sovereignty, that Mao Zedong appears. A man named Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong is probably the most contradictory person of the 20th century, and depending on where you are in the world, he is seen in completely different ways. In 49, after a long civil war with the nationalist government, Mao proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China, and what he did next was something that seemed almost impossible at the time. He managed to unite a vast territory with hundreds of different peoples and completely different groups, different languages under one flag and one government. For those who understand here how complex and large China is, this is already an extraordinary feat. China is not a homogeneous country. It is almost a continent within a country. There are completely different people, different languages, different groups, and peoples, and Mao kind of stitched all of this into one government. But look, I'm not saying this with enthusiasm because what follows is certainly one of the darkest moments in history. In 1958, Mao launched what he called the Great Leap Forward. In other words, he wanted to transform China, which was an agricultural country, into an industrial power in a few years. Many peasants were forced to abandon their fields to produce steel in improvised furnaces at the back of villages. The harvests rotted in the fields with no one to collect them, and when famine spread through the interior of China, the official reports that reached Beijing showed much lower numbers because no one had the courage to tell the truth to the leader. The result was one of the greatest humanitarian catastrophes in history, and it didn't stop there. In 1966, Mao launched the Cultural Revolution. The goal was to eliminate those he considered enemies of the government or enemies of the revolution. But in practice, this meant the persecution of many people: intellectuals, teachers, doctors, artists. Anyone who represented knowledge or a tradition not approved by the party of the country became a victim of this. Many religious temples were destroyed, books were burned, and much worse things happened. The Cultural Revolution lasted a decade and left deep wounds that China carries to this day, even though many prefer not to talk about them. So why do the Communist Party and the current Chinese government still revere Mao? Why is his portrait still hanging in Tiananmen Square in Beijing? One of the answers to this is that letting go of Mao would mean letting go of the Communist Party itself. Admitting that the modern Chinese state was a mistake is something no political system will do on its own. Just like that, out of the blue, voluntarily, saying, "Oh, we're so good-hearted, let's give up power so the people can govern." There are many intellectuals in China, even within the party, who deal with this by saying that Mao was 70% right and 70% wrong. A calculation that seems a bit off, right? But China doesn't end there. After Mao's fall, another person emerged, and if there's one thing we can say, it's that this person saved China. His name is Deng Xiaoping. Deng is a very interesting character in this story because he experienced firsthand the contradictions and problems of the system he helped create. He had been a party member since he was young, a revolutionary fighter, but he was persecuted twice during the Cultural Revolution. Twice he was removed, humiliated, and then managed to return. When Mao passed away in 1976, China was economically destroyed. Decades of crazy experiments had left the country stagnant, stuck in time while the rest of Asia was only growing. Japan had rebuilt itself and become a powerhouse. South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore were taking off at that time, and China, with over 1 billion people, still had the majority of its population living in very poor conditions. In 1978, Deng came to power and did something no other Chinese communist leader had done before. He admitted that the Chinese model needed to change, and he launched what became known as the policy of reform and opening up. And here's a phrase that is generally attributed to him: "It doesn't matter if the cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice." In other words, it doesn't matter if the policy is capitalist or communist. What matters is if it works. In practice, what Deng did was to open special economic zones on the coast of China, areas where foreign companies could come to China and do business within the country. They could hire Chinese workers under very good conditions. Foreign capital came in, technology came in, and the Chinese workers, very disciplined, numerous, and willing to work for very low wages, produced for the entire world. And at the same time, Deng didn't give up anything politically. The party remained in absolute control. There were no free elections, no independent press, no opposition within China. The opening of the country was purely economic, never political, and this is probably the most important point of this video. China did not adopt capitalism. It used capitalism as a tool while keeping the steering wheel firmly in the hands of the party. But how is China doing nowadays? Did it manage to become a truly communist country? Let me explain better. I want you to erase the government models you know from your mind. China is not a market democracy like the United States or Brazil. It is also not a Soviet-style planned economy communism, where the government controls the entire economy with an iron fist. China, in fact, is a country with an economic and governmental model very different from anything we've seen before. But there are some things that can be explained quite well. The Chinese Communist Party is not a party in the sense we know. It does not compete with other parties. It does not need to convince voters every 4 years. It is the government, it is the state. It is everywhere at the same time, in companies, universities, neighborhoods, villages, in every place imaginable. Private companies exist in China, and some of them are even gigantic. But the party is always inside them. Large Chinese corporations are required to have party cells within their internal structure. When the government decides that a company has grown too big, or that its founder has too much influence, it usually acts. The case of Jack Ma, the founder of Alibaba, one of the largest technology companies in the world, is quite illustrative and explains this very well. After making public statements criticizing Chinese regulators, he disappeared from the spotlight for months. His company was fined billions, and his power was drastically reduced. No public trial was needed. Just a signal from the party was enough. At the same time, the Chinese government invests massively in strategic sectors: energy, telecommunications, banks. Not because it is communist in theory, but because it understands that controlling these sectors is controlling real power. One of the advantages of this type of centralized government in China is that they can plan things more efficiently and act much faster, because there is no opposition. There is no one who can tell the party what to do and what not to do. There is also a cultural element that cannot be ignored. China has a millennia-old Confucian tradition that highly values hierarchy, the collective above the individual, and respect for authorities. This doesn't mean that the Chinese are passive or that they don't question anything. It means that this relationship between society and government is historically different from the rest of the world, and this is one of the reasons why it works in China. And the country has grown tremendously, on a frightening scale. In 1980, China had a per capita income equivalent to countries like Bangladesh or Ethiopia. Nowadays, they are the second largest economy in the entire world, and only behind the United States. In technology, for example, China has transitioned from being the factory that copied the world's products to becoming a leader in areas such as artificial intelligence, solar energy, electric vehicles, and 5G networks. Companies like Huawei, PID, ByteDance, the one behind TikTok, are now references and no longer copies of anything. So, everything seems very beautiful, and it's a wonderful country, right? Not quite, and I'm going to show you why. This is where a part starts that many people prefer not to tell. I'll leave it half done there. China's growth has a side that doesn't appear on economic charts, and I need to talk about it honestly here. China is a country that doesn't tolerate much dissent and any minimal political interference by the population. If you don't know what I'm talking about, I can't say much about it here in this video, but I've made an entire video about it, so it will be passing here on your screen. You can click above where the name is appearing, or at the end I'll leave it too. So check out that video, watch it, and there I'll explain in detail how this issue works here in China. In the end, we return to the same question: why did China succeed? And the answer is that it wasn't communism that succeeded. It was a mutation of it, a version that Marx himself probably wouldn't recognize, and that the founders would have considered a betrayal. What China did to grow was extreme pragmatism, and many factors combined in a very efficient way. A society already accustomed to this type of government, the right moment in history, a centralized government with absolute power, and an economy that draws from international capitalism, but without a free market, without interference, the government does whatever it wants. And this is the perfect recipe for growing a country, no matter what happens. You and I might even consider this immoral, but it's undeniable that it works. Now, at what cost did they achieve this? Thank you very much for watching until here, and I'll see you in the next video.